I'm joined now by the Pentagon's former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense on European and NATO policy, Jim Townsend. Jim, Jens Stoltenberg spoke then about preventing a conflict, but of course it's too late for that now, isn't it? So is it reasonable to expect NATO powers to respond with military intervention at this stage? And if so, what should it look like?
Well, I think we have to look at this in terms of Ukraine versus allies. What the Stoltenberg particularly was talking about was reinforcing the alliance along the borders with Russia and with Ukraine. And that's ongoing right now. Those allies are doing their own reinforcing as well. They have increased their alerts. They're doing things internally to make sure that they bolster their deterrent against something that might spill over from the fighting in Ukraine. But what is not being talked about now and is off the table is allied forces, whether from the United States, whether from other allies in Europe, going into Ukraine to fight the Russians. That's not on the table. We've been sending lots of supplies. We've been training Ukraine troops certainly since 2014, if not before. The relationship between Ukraine and NATO in terms of helping Ukraine build its military force is a long one. And it picked up over the past year in terms of resupplying Ukraine, but that does not involve sending troops. So what's the focus now, and what Stoltenberg is really referring to is that we were not able to deter the Russians from going into Ukraine, but we must deter the Russians from doing anything against an ally, and that's what he's referring to.
But do you think that putting allied boots on the ground in Ukraine should be off the table?
Well, yes, I do. Our first job within the alliance is to protect allies. And right now, that's a big enough task because we didn't do enough over the past 20, 25 years, certainly since the end of the Cold War, to hedge against the possibility that Russia would do what it's doing today. So we have a lot on our plate right now just to protect the allies, and we're doing that. In
And
terms of you,
so,
yes.
go ahead, go ahead.
In terms of Ukraine, in terms of putting allied boots into Ukraine, that's off the table. That's not going to happen. We have done our best to help them defend themselves, and that's the best that we can do right now.
There does seem to be an irony to the fact that we've been talking about this situation for weeks now. You know, I'm well aware of that sitting in the seat I currently occupy. And yet it seems that allied leaders have actually been taken by surprise by Putin's audacity on this. Is that the sense that you have?
Absolutely right. I think it's something that I think the surprise was that something that no one thought would happen, certainly with the end of the Cold War, would indeed happen. As much as of the intel picture that was presented, as much as what you and your seat and me and a number of us who watch this day to day, you could see it coming together. And I think while we might have predicted it, I think myself and a number of others said this is going to be likely to happen. To actually see it unfold, unlike anything that we've seen in so many decades, it's still a shock. It's still stunning, and I think we're coming to grips with that. But I think we should be reminded that we need to brace ourselves for what will come in the weeks ahead. I'm not sure when the fighting will end in Ukraine. It could be quicker than people think, but we will still have to deal with a Putin who is irrational, a Putin who the veil has certainly lifted based on the speech that he gave. And so it's Europe itself, and particularly the region around Ukraine, needs to be very concerned about what Putin's next step could be.
And is there a sense as well that Putin's long-term tenure, designated, is actually an advantage for him in comparison to, the short-term politics of Western democracies where governments are interested in, being re-elected, to be quite blunt?
Well, autocracies and dictatorships and strongman rule, that has its upsides, but the downsides are so horrible on those with that type of government that I'd rather have the turmoil that comes with democracies, that comes with having elections and having new leaders come in, and that impact on a nation's foreign policy or a nation's direction can can be can be chaotic. I mean, we see that here in the United States, certainly, and we see that across the West. But I would rather have that turmoil. I would rather have the ugly business sometimes that democracies can be than to have the trains run on time, as usually what comes with an autocracy or a strongman rule.
Jim Townsend, the Pentagon's former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense on European and NATO policy, thank you very much for joining me here on Times Radio. So Christopher Mayer is former British ambassador to the US and Germany. Christopher, thank you for joining me. You've said before that the Prime Minister must bring his actions in line with his bombastic rhetoric. Does his statement, the one we've just heard, cut the mustard, in your opinion?
Well, we'll see, won't we? I think it's at 5 o'clock this afternoon. He's going to be telling the House of Commons what exactly the next stage in the barrage of sanctions is going to be. And the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So let's see what he says. What he said just now this morning after the Cobra meeting, perfectly reasonable. Okay, but we need to see precisely the devil in the detail.
Do you think that we've been too slow with the sort of sanctions that would be required to even cause a dent to Putin's ambitions?
Well, I don't think actually that any sanctions would have stopped Putin. I think Putin is marching to his own beat. It is not the beat of a cool, rational chess player. It is the beat of someone who has moved as much as anything by emotion and by isolation from the reality of the world around him. I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence coming out of Moscow, particularly out of certain journalists who are in the Kremlin press pool, saying that he has been isolated for so long because of his fear of COVID that he is starting to lose touch with reality. And we saw that in the rambling speech he gave a couple of days ago, whenever it was. And I also think that this act of invasion, of comprehensive invasion from three sides around Ukraine, is far from being an act of cunning calculation, an act of supreme self-harming stupidity.
Will that sense of him perhaps losing his grip on reality filter down to the Russian people, in your opinion? Is there any possibility that this will be a final straw for them? Because let's face it, economically in particular, they're pretty beleaguered at the moment.
Well, Mariella, you make a good point. You do make a good point. And I'm all for sanctions, knock down the oligarchs who tend to be Putin supporters. Well, that's all fine and dandy and should be done. And London's reputation as a laundromat should be brought to a close. But I think the long-term ambition, maybe the medium-term ambition of sanctions, is actually to drive a wedge between the Russian people and Putin, because Putin is totally detached from them, as far as I can see. And so if it is the case that the sanctions that we all bring into force starts to run the Russian economy down even more, so the standard of living starts to decline even further, this will be the right kind of wedge to put between the Russian people and Putin. And my crystal ball is as cloudy as anybody else's on this whole business, but I would not be surprised if in the end Putin comes out badly inside his own country from this extraordinary self-harming invasion.
You were ambassador to Germany, as I mentioned in the introduction, as well as to the US. And of course, the Germans are much more reliant on Russian gas than we are. But is that, a particular vulnerability for Western leaders in general?
Well, right now, to be dependent on the Russians for anything
Yes,
is
indeed.
a vulnerability. And there are a number of countries who are heavily dependent on Russian gas in order to fuel their economies and who are going to suffer greatly. Now, for example, the Germans, Chancellor Scholz, has decided to suspend the pipeline agreement. So, yeah, it's going to be the thing, Mariella, I think that needs to be said is This is such a shocking event in the 21st century that this century is not going to look the same ever again after Putin's action today. We can't quite work out what the long-term consequences are going to be. But one of them, quite apart from an energy shortage, which will be temporary until Russian gas is replaced, is that Europe is going to turn into an armed camp. And the very thing that Putin said that he wanted to have happen, which is the dismantling of NATO's presence in the old Warsaw Pact countries, NATO pushing its boundaries back again from their eastern position. None of that is now going to happen. He's done something which directly contradicts the draft treaties which he sent to Washington and to NATO Brussels at the beginning of the year. It is a chaotic and irrational response to the situation.
Do you think that it also suggests that we've been too apathetic, particularly in the last 20 years, but dare I say, in the aftermath of the Second World War, all of the structures that we set up in order to prevent this happening seem to be powerless to prevent it happening at this point?
Well, if you're going to take a big state like Russia, who is determined to drive a coach and horses through not only the dispensation put in place after the Second World War, forgive me, but also some of the agreements that were the fruit of détente. Do you remember détente and Henry Kissinger and Nixon going to Moscow and all those things? I mean, the Cold War was a highly regulated war, if I can put it like that. What Putin has done is to take away all those rules of the road which we had to avoid nuclear war during the Cold War, and we are now living in a jungle. And one of the things that has been destroyed is the 1975 Helsinki Final Act. Not many people remember it. You have to be my age to have any recollection of it.
Or a historian.
Or a historian, yes. And this very organization, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is supposed to monitor all this stuff and control it, has been made now to look like is a fruit of the Helsinki Final Act and has been made to look an impotent bunch of people who can do nothing to control the situation.
Just before you go, Sir Christopher Mayor, is there a diplomatic answer? You're a career diplomat.
Well, there's a time for war, there's a time for diplomacy, and there's a time for diplomacy backed by the credible threat of war. At the moment, I don't see any role for a diplomat anywhere. Putin has chosen a military path. And at some point along this path, the moment may come for the diplomats to be ushered back into the room. But right now, as you and I are speaking, they've been expelled from the council chamber and the warriors are there instead. And it's a sad, sad day for Europe. And let me say, it's a sad, sad day for Russia, because when I saw the first, if I can say, the first video pictures of what was going on in Ukraine, you know what it reminded me of?
What?
The Nazis invading Poland in 1939 and the Nazis invading the old Soviet Union in 1941. And that is a terrible, terrible image for modern Russia to have.
Sobering words there. Sir Christopher Mayer, former British ambassador to the US and Germany, thank you very much for joining me. 6 Russian aircraft with at least 40 Ukrainian troops killed so far, along with a number of civilian casualties too. And in the last hour, CNN is reporting that Russian forces have taken control of Hostomel Airport near the capital, Kiev. Well, here with us to give us an update is Catherine Philp, Times correspondent in Kiev. Catherine, what's the latest on the ground where you are now?
Hi, Mariella. Well, you mentioned there the airfield that has reportedly been captured now by the Russians. That's the focus of a lot of our attention right now. In Kiev, it's an airfield where Russian attack helicopters have been sent in today. Our suspicion is that they want to take that as a forward position to launch some sort of assault on the capital. It's not clear if that would be a conventional assault or whether that may be some kind of decapitation strike at the Ukrainian government, because at the moment the ground forces that Russia's been inserting into Ukraine are really only just across the Belarusian border, so they're still some way away.
Kim Samgupta, who we spoke to earlier, mentioned the fact that one case scenario is that Putin will just surround Kiev and use that to broker, agreement from leaders for his demands, as it were. Is that a story that you've been hearing as well?
There are several scenarios that I think we're following. We're sort of responding to the events we see, trying to figure out what they tell us about what might be next. I mean, certainly what happened very early this morning when the first strikes happened on and around Kiev was that they were very much focused on military infrastructure and appeared to be designed to take out air defenses. And we're seeing more action kind of in the skies in and around Kiev at the moment, which suggests that they may have been successful in that. That seems to be part of the strategy of taking this airfield. So whether they can get ground troops into that area is another question. I think that the Ukrainians have much more chance of defending Kiev from the ground than they do from the air. So it may be that the Russians see inserting troops by air as a better option for them.
I can see you're in your hotel room at the moment. What are you seeing on the street outside? What are the sounds? What's the atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, I've been out and about, coming to and fro all day just to gauge the changes in atmosphere. Obviously, it started before most people had even thought about going to work and woke people up. The air sirens going off. I then got a call from my translator, quite understandably, to tell me that he was leaving the capital, taking his family out of Kiev, which a lot of people have done. And that's why I think you were talking earlier about these extraordinary tailbacks we're seeing in the traffic, partly also created by the fact that a state of emergency and martial law has been declared now. So there's checkpoints all around the city to make sure, obviously, that there are no hostile forces getting in that way, but they are creating this backup. The streets are incredibly quiet now, deathly quiet. President Zelensky did call on people to stay at home, and those who haven't left the city appear to be observing that, having gone this morning to busy supermarkets to stock up on supplies. The streets are now clear. There's extremely little traffic, except for military vehicles we've seen moving through the city and pushing out towards the districts where some quite heavy fighting is going on north of Kiev.
Are people still fleeing? And if so, where are they fleeing to? Is there a sense of there being a part of Ukraine that's safer to be in?
Apart from the fact that there is clearly a belief that Kiev is going to be targeted, and the problem of airstrikes or the threat of airstrikes on a crowded city like this, one of the things that people have been waiting to happen is for things like water and electricity to be cut off, which actually the Russians could do simply with cyber attacks. So they wouldn't even have to bomb power stations and water plants for that to happen. So a lot of people's rationale is to go out to, say, family they have in their villages or their sort of ancestral villages, or a country home they might have that have their own wells and electricity supplies, and just be away from the target that is Kiev.
And just finally, the Ukrainian military response so far to the invasion, is it in evidence?
Yes, I mean, it's very, very difficult, obviously, in the center of Kiev to see what the military are doing because they're taking the fight outside. But we've heard of some pretty fierce fighting on the ground going on in all along the eastern border and indeed north and south of Kiev. They are pushing back very hard on these sort of Russian propaganda reports that are coming out saying that Ukrainian troops have surrendered, and saying that that's absolutely not the case. You mentioned the 40 military casualties we've been told of. That was actually a figure we got about lunchtime, and since then the Ukrainians have told us that they are not updating it. So they're not trying to obscure the number. They're just saying we're not updating it whilst things are so active. The problem, I think, for the Ukrainians is that they simply don't have as sophisticated air defenses as they need to to hold off a Russian air assault. So what the Russians are doing quite forensically is going in and targeting those defenses first, taking them out, and then I think we will see more land forces come in behind that, and probably fighting will get much nastier in the coming days.
Are there troops, Ukrainian troops, on the streets of Kiev then?
There are, and some of them are moving out to other places, including reservists who've been called up. So yesterday, an order went out for the operational reserve, who are people who fought on the front line in the last kind of major conflict in 2014 to 15. So 36,000 of them are moving around reporting for duty, but they're not in the center of Kiev. They're not acting in a defensive role. They're moving around and reporting to places that they are going elsewhere. So they're not visible in a defensive sense here.
Catherine, wishing you all the best there in Kiev. That was Catherine Phil, the Times correspondent in Kiev.